From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Oncology Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinions featured in JAMA Oncology.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to JAMA Oncology Podcast. I am Vivek Subbiah, Chief Early Phase Drug Development, Sarah Cannon Research Institute, Nashville, Tennessee, and also the web editor for JAMA Oncology. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Tobias Janowitz and Dr. Karen Winkfield, who have led a publication called Analysis and Optimization of Equitable U.S. Cancer Clinical Trial Center Access by Travel Time. Dr. Janowitz is from Cold Spring Harbor, New York, and Dr. Winkfield is from Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you so much. Please go ahead and introduce yourself, and let's start the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Subbiah. My name is Tobias Janowitz. I lead a research laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor Labs on Long Island. I am a medical oncologist as well as a laboratory scientist, so a clinician scientist. And I have an interest in conducting clinical trials where we either translate findings from our own laboratory or where we try to think about the infrastructure by which we deliver clinical trials to enable better participation and to enable the most informative endpoints to be measured.
Wow, interesting. So let's move on to Dr. Karen Winkfield. It's a pleasure and honor having you here.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful. I'm a radiation oncologist. I'm currently the executive director of the Meharry Vanderbilt Alliance, which is a strategic partnership between Meharry Medical College, one of the 4 historically Black institutions that have medical schools attached to them, and Vanderbilt University Medical Center. But I've been engaged in health equity research and community engaged research for decades. And in fact, I've been working quite a bit with how do we improve inclusive participation in clinical trials. I'd worked with the National Institutes during the COVID pandemic to help them engaging communities. And so it was really a wonderful opportunity to pair with Tobias in thinking about how we can really shed some light in terms of where clinical trials are happening today and what we might be able to do to try to increase participation with communities that have been oftentimes disengaged and disenfranchised.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and honor having you here. And again, we all know that clinical research must improve care for everybody. And minoritized and socioeconomically disadvantaged populations are underrepresented in clinical trials. So thank you so much for bringing this important work to JAMA Oncology. So let's go to the paper, right? Analysis and optimization of equitable U.S. Cancer Clinical Trial Center access by travel time. So can you please give us a brief overview of your study?
Thank you. Sure. So we set out to understand what the distribution of the populations around the most active clinical trial centers in the US was, and also what in general the distribution of populations is in the proximity of hospitals and healthcare structures within the US. In order to do this, we leveraged publicly available data. So a lot of this data can be freely downloaded and then can be quantified and analyzed. And that's exactly what we did. And we did that to answer the question, what are the population characteristics in these proximities of centers of interest? And what we found was that the populations are socioeconomically better off and also in tendency enriched for white patients. So in other words, within the proximity of the most active clinical trial centers, there are more well-to-do white individuals compared to the US population. We then went on to try and reverse engineer these findings a little bit and essentially to use the data to ask questions such as, if we wanted to run a clinical trial with a certain population of patients, where would we potentially be best off in terms of catchment areas, again, within certain travel times from the centers. And finally, we drew up maps of most of the urban areas of the United States, of all cities with a population of above 500,000 inhabitants, to then illustrate the distribution of the populations based on certain characteristics around hospitals. And we hope that such maps may perhaps be sort of a nucleation information that others can use and that we can use in order to strategize about future clinical trial design.
Well, thank you so much for that detailed overview of the study. So we know that socioeconomic deprivation and travel time to trial centers can definitely impair trial participation. So here you used some unique method that you used to gather the data for the study. Can you briefly describe the methods so that the listeners can understand what methods you used to gather the data for the study?
Sure. So we essentially restricted ourselves to publicly available data. And we did that for two reasons. Firstly, so that others can reproduce our findings and can also ask questions that are close to their heart. And the other is because there is actually a wealth of data available within the US information setting. We specifically used the US Census data, the American Community Survey, the NCI designated cancer center list, and then the trial data from the National Trial Registry and the hospital distribution data from the National Homeland Infrastructure Foundation. And so, equipped with those data, we were able to intersect the data sets to answer the questions that we were asking.
So, how does the demographic composition of catchment populations within the 30-minute commute distance of a major US cancer trial site compared to the general US population, specifically in terms of socioeconomic factors and racial diversity?
So we measured this in two ways. First, we looked at income level. Second, we looked at an index which is called the deprivation index, which has been developed by others in order to capture an overview of the socioeconomic status of a population. And this takes into consideration information such as how crowded are the households? Do individuals have access to a vehicle? What is the level of single parents with children under the age of 18? And other factors, and they are combined into this index. And the higher the index, the higher the socioeconomic deprivation. And with that in mind, what we found in the proximity of the trial centers, on average, the populations were less deprived compared to the average US population, had a higher median income, and were more likely to self-identify as white with a higher income.
So, Vivek, if I can just add what some of the significance of this is. As you've clearly stated, we know that for most clinical trials, oftentimes there is a very homogeneous population that's included from a racial and ethnic standpoint. We also know from previous studies that oftentimes individuals who are of lower socioeconomic status also are underrepresented in clinical trials. And so if indeed we are intending to be more inclusive, yet the people who are closest to where these clinical trials are being held are oftentimes of that same homogeneous population, it means we might have to think a little bit differently about how we're doing clinical research. And the index that was utilized in this particular study is one index. There are several others, but again, thinking about some of the major things that go into thinking about socioeconomic status and the social determinants of health are really all incorporated into this indices. And so it's very important for clinical trialists and cancer centers alike to really start to think, are we doing the right thing by having clinical trials only at the main hub? And not to say that everyone does, but one of the beautiful things about this paper is it also looked to see what other sites could potentially be utilized that might be part of a healthcare system that might potentially be sites for research. And that's important because we know that individuals who are of lower socioeconomic status struggle oftentimes with transportation. That is a major issue just to receive clinical care. And so, as you know, the complexity of clinical trials may make it such that individuals need to travel more frequently to a site. So we need to think differently about the way that we are doing clinical trials so that we can indeed become more inclusive in the design and the implementation of trials at all levels.
Again, personally, I think this is a brilliant analysis because, we know, right, from many, many studies that many populations are excluded from trial participation, like specifically racial, ethnic minorities, adolescents, young adults, older adults, rural patients, sexual and gender minorities. And, you have in this paper brought to light modifiable socioeconomic factors such as affordable transportation and increasing, financial toxicity. So again, in the analysis of the major US clinical trial sites, what are the implications of the observed disparities in trial population, particularly in relation to racial representation and the socioeconomic status of the catchment populations?
What is important is that not only can we capture what the current distribution is, and that there is this imbalance in that we have a very homogeneous population that tends to be well off compared to the average US population in the proximity of clinical trial centers. It is also important to note that with the data that are available and that we have analyzed, we can look at the question the other way around. We can ask the question, where would you want to go? And which other sites would you want to include in order to get closer to the populations that may represent what you hope to include in your clinical trials? So, in other words, that might be racially more diverse and also socioeconomically more diverse. And that is actually an analysis that we present in the paper, but we only give an example for it. You have to remember that there are different ways to set the thresholds for such an analysis, and our analysis is only an exemplar. People can toggle whichever questions they want to answer and whichever parameters they want to modify based on our analysis.
Yeah, and one other thing that I think is really important. This goes to why this particular study is important now. There's ongoing conversations with Moonshot 2.0 and also with the cancer plan about the importance of navigation, right? As a way to try to improve not only access to clinical care, but also to research. And so if we know that there may be some challenges, some barriers to individuals to being able to access care, navigation is one way to consider helping to alleviate some of those. But that infrastructure needs to be put in place before you actually start to design the way clinical trials are. One other thing to consider is during the pandemic, we really learned throughout COVID-19 that we can do things differently, including decentralizing clinical trials, including allowing individuals to consent to clinical trials remotely, perhaps getting blood draws closer to home. So all of these things need to continually be on the minds of researchers and cancer centers about how do we make sure that the trial is going to be of most benefit to the patient, not just with respect to the science itself, but even with around the access issues.
And I would like to add to that, one of the reasons why we even conceived of this idea was that we did conduct within the COVID period a fully remote, decentralized clinical trial where the patients did not have to come to the trial center. So essentially, we took the trial to the patient rather than bringing the patient to the trial. And without making any explicit effort, we found that we had 33% African American participants and 25% Hispanic individuals.
Wow, isn't that fascinating? So again, you have given visual maps, right? So how do the maps and visualizations created in the study, particularly those for cities like New York and Houston, right, close to major cancer centers, provide insights into geographical distribution of diverse populations and their proximity to existing cancer research hospitals? So again, what strategic considerations can be, derived from this map. So one thing, as you already mentioned in the limitation section, is that the calculated catchment areas may definitely differ from the true population served by a cancer center. So what other strategic considerations can be derived from these maps?
Yes, thank you. So I want to start by saying that I am aware that many of the clinical trial centers, if not all of them, strive to improve and continuously enhance the representation in clinical trials. So what we are trying to do here is we are trying to offer a geographic representation of the increased catchment areas of clinical trial centers so that people who were to think about clinical trials could look at these maps and say, well, there is perhaps a satellite hospital in an catchment area that we are currently not engaging with for our clinical trial, but that has a population that would be ideally included in our clinical trial. And maybe we should reach out to them and see if we can establish a clinical trial infrastructure or enrollment from that healthcare center. So, in other words, it should enable strategic thinking. It is very important to know that some of the main clinical trial centers may already include some of these satellite centers. So, this is just an example of how geographical representations can enhance that clinical or strategic thinking. I think it's also important to note that the maps are only examples. So, what is really key here is one could change completely which target population or population distribution one would want to display. And then the maps may look completely different, as you can imagine. So, what is good for one trial in terms of the geographic distribution may not be so suitable for another. So, one can actually turn on the color maps into the pattern that best fit the target population for the clinical trial that one envisages.
Yeah, so Vivek, these are tools, right, to help us. And I often say, as you've heard many times before, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes it's very helpful to actually have tools that enable us to see exactly what's around us. And I've done a lot of asset mapping in the work that I've done when I was associate director of cancer centers, really specific to the catchment area that the cancer center serves, right? You kind of say, okay, who are the individuals, what are the populations, what are the demographics? And to have a tool like this that exists that enables you not only to see the population density, but also where potential partners may be is critical. And again, this is not to say that the sites that are listed there are not currently being enlisted, but it's a way to think about the infrastructure build. And are there ways that we can build capacity in the community? And to give you an example, I work very closely with the NCI's Community Oncology Research Program, right? The NCI's NCORP program, which has 1,000 sites all over the nation that are able to do trials. And through the NCORP, when you look at the percent of racial and ethnic minorities that are enrolled in the trials that are in the NCORP studies, it's about 20%. Versus when you look at phase 1-2 clinical trials that are being done, that are oftentimes sponsored by different companies, their percent enrollment is oftentimes less than 10%. So we have clear examples of how thinking about sites and thinking about where clinical trials happen can, in fact, improve inclusive participation. This is just a tool to help guide folks to really think about things in a different way.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I completely agree. A picture is worth 1,000 words. I really like your analysis, the way you've identified biases in socio-demographics of populations living within commuting distance to US-based cancer trial sites. So let me ask you this question. So in what ways can the study's findings inform strategies to improve equitable access to clinical trials?
Yeah, I think it's important to note here that this is a first step. So in other words, we have not shown, and that is a limitation of our study, that implementation of these tools actually makes a difference to the enrollment in clinical trials. And that would be a natural next step to take. In other words, utilization of these tools in order to change clinical practice as it comes to clinical trial enrollment, perhaps with a specific small sample in mind to start off with, and then to test, does the utilization of such tools actually enhance the representation in clinical trials?
Dr. Winkfield, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think we've articulated a bit some of what we're hoping could come out of this. Having a visual like this to show where populations are in proximity to different cancer centers that have clinical trials ongoing is a really helpful tool to say where might there be some opportunities, right? It's simply that. And I will say, when it comes to the urban settings, you got to remember we're looking at driving distance in this particular study. We did not look at public transportation, which is a whole other thing. So even for places like New York, where there is a good public transportation system, it can often still take, 2 hours to get from one side of the city to the other. And so that's also a limitation of this study. But I think it's important to, again, think about just the visualization, the ability to really utilize this to say, is there an opportunity for us to use navigation to help support patients who might be living a distance 30, 60 or more minutes away from a center? Are there ways for us to think about engaging other sites that might be closer to where people live, particularly those populations that we might be most interested in involving in trials? These are just ways that we can start to think about how this data could be utilized.
And what is important to note as well is one can think about restructuring within, of course, I realize there are other factors that influence it, but restructuring networks that deliver clinical trials as well. Because you have to remember, perhaps there is strategically an opportunity in certain areas to work across a network of healthcare centers that has not previously worked together at all, but is broader than just a main hub and a few satellites.
Thank you so much, both. Again, great analysis on and clearly showing that data-driven approaches may reduce current disparities in clinical trial populations. So, finally, any final comments on the paper and next steps? So maybe we can take one by one.
Thank you. I hope that the community welcomes our study and critically appraises it, but also embraces it in the way that I have outlined it. Perhaps there will be a few centers that reach out to us to think strategically together with us how they can enhance their representation in clinical trials. That would be a really welcome outcome. In addition, I should say we are very mindful that some historically underrepresented minorities are not covered in our current paper. For example, we don't comment at all on the Hispanic population. And one of the homework that we have is to expand our analysis so that we capture other communities as well. And we've actually just completed a study where we look at the Hispanic population to try and communicate the findings from that perspective as well, so that thought structures can be all-encompassing for those populations who we want to include in clinical studies.
And I'd just like to say I'm very grateful for the opportunity to even talk about social determinants of health, to even talk about populations that have been excluded from research in the past, because I can tell you as someone who's been in this field for several decades, I have stacks of manuscripts that have gone unnoticed, that there was really not an interest in understanding how we can engage communities differently. So I just want to congratulate JAMA for this opportunity. And I really am grateful because I think that this is one example of how we can really rethink the way that we're doing our science to be more inclusive so that we can do everything we can to eliminate the disparities that currently exist. So I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity and just want to thank Tobias for engaging me in this project and really just, again, thankful for the conversations that we know are going to come from this and that have already begun around this particular work. So thank you.
Karen, I would like to reciprocate, and I should say as well, and I think Dr. Subbiah will be pleased to hear this, that through projects like this, communication starts between individuals who normally would not necessarily work together. And I would like to give a shout out for our authorship team. We had a wonderful group of authors with varying expertise who came together to write this manuscript that none of us could have written alone.
Congratulations for this phenomenal work, and congratulations to you both and the authorship team for spearheading this. So thank you so much. I am Dr. Vivek Subbiah, and I've been speaking with Dr. Tobias Janowitz and Dr. Karen Winkfield on their recent paper in JAMA Oncology, Analysis and Optimization of Equitable U.S. Cancer Clinical Trial Center Access by Travel Time. They have demonstrated that racial and socioeconomic disparities in commuting distance to U.S. cancer clinical trial sites identifies prospective satellite trial sites that are located close to diverse populations. You can find a link to the article in this episode's description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. Thank you so much to everyone for listening.